Chapter 16 of the Life of Thomas, Lord Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald, Volume 1, by Henry Richard Fox Bourne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, 1826 to 1827. During the 21 weary months that elapsed between Lord Cochrane's acceptance of service in the Greek War of Independence and his actual participation in the work, the Revolution passed through a new and disastrous stage. In the summer of 1825, when the invitation was sent to him, the disorganization of the Greeks and the superior strength of the Turks, and yet more of their Egyptian and Arabian allies under Ibrahim Pasha, were threatening to undo all that had been achieved in the previous years. One bold stand had begun to be made, in which, throughout nearly a whole year, the Greeks fought with unsurpassed heroism, and then the whole struggle for liberty fell into the lawless and disordered condition which had already prevailed in many districts, and which was then to become universal, and to offer obstacles too great even for Lord Cochrane's genius to overcome in his efforts to revive genuine patriotism and to render thoroughly successful the cause that he had espoused. The last great stand was at Missolonghi. Built on the edge of a marshy plain, bounded on the north by the high hills of Zygos, and protected on the south by the shallow lagoons at the mouth of the Gulf of Lepanto, and chiefly tenanted by hardy fishermen, this town had been the first in Western Greece to take part in the Revolution. Here, in 1821, nearly all the Moslem residents had been slaughtered, the wealthiest and most serviceable only being spared to become the slaves of their Christian masters. In the 2 months of 1822, the Ottomans had made a desperate attempt to win back the stronghold, but its inhabitants, led by Mavrocordatos, who had lately come to join in the work of regeneration, had resolutely beaten off the invaders and taken revenge upon the few Turks still resident among them. "The wife of one of the Turkish inhabitants of Missolonghi," said an English visitor in 1824, "imploring my pity, begged me to allow her to remain under my roof in order to shelter her from the brutality and cruelty of the Greeks. They had murdered all her relations. A little girl, 9 years old, remained to be the only companion of her misery." Missolonghi continued to be one of the chief strongholds of independence in continental Greece, and the revolutionists, being forced into it by the Turks, who scoured the districts north and east of it in 1824 and 1825, it became in the latter year the main object of attack and the scene of most desperate resistance. Here were concentrated the chief energies of the Greek warriors and of their Moslem antagonists, and here was exhibited the last and most heroic effort of the patriots, unaided by foreign champions of note, in their long and hard-fought battle for freedom. Reshid Pasha, the ablest of the Turkish generals, having advanced into the neighbourhood of Missolonghi toward the end of April, began to besiege it in good earnest at the head of an army of some 7,000 or 8,000 picked followers on the 7th of May. While he was forming his entrenchments and erecting his batteries, the townsmen, augmented by a number of fierce Suliots and others, were strengthening their defences. They increased their ramparts, and organized a garrison of 4,000 soldiers and armed peasants, with 1,000 citizens and boatmen as auxiliaries. At first the tide of fortune was with them. The Turks had to defend themselves as best they could from numerous sorties, well planned and well executed in May and June, and fresh courage came to the Greeks with the intelligence that Admiral Miaoulis was on his way to the port with as powerful a fleet as he could muster. While he was being expected, however, on the 10th of July, the Turkish Captain Pasha of Greece arrived with 55 vessels. Miaoulis, with 40 Greek sail, made his appearance on the 2nd of August. Thus the naval and military forces of both sides were brought into formidable opposition. At first the Greeks triumphed on the sea. In the night of the 3rd of August, Miaoulis, finding that Missolonghi was being greatly troubled by the blockade established by the Turks, cleverly placed himself to windward of the enemy's line, and at daybreak on the 4th he dispersed the squadron nearest the shore. At noon the whole Turkish force came against him. He met them bravely, but being able to do no more than hold his own by the ordinary method of warfare, he sent 3 fireships against them in the afternoon. The Turks did not wait to be injured by them. They fled at once, going all the way to Alexandria in search of safety. Miaoulis then lost no time in seconding his first exploit by another. A detachment of the army of Eastern Greece, under the brave generals Karasakas and Zevelas, having been sent to harass Reshid Pasha's operations, The admiral assisted them in a successful piece of strategy. The Turks were, on the 6th of August, attacked simultaneously by the ships and by the outlying battalions of Greeks, while 1,500 of the garrison rushed out upon the invaders. 4 Turkish batteries were seized, and a great number of their defenders were killed and captured. The remainder, after tough fighting during 3 hours and a half, being driven so far back that much of the besieging work had to be done over again. Miaoulis then went in search of the Ottoman fleet, leaving the townsmen, who were enabled by the raising of the blockade to receive fresh supplies of food, ammunition, and men, to continue their defence with a good heart. Reshid Pasha vigorously restored his siege operations, but attempting to force his way into the town on the 21st of September, was again seriously repulsed. The Turks were allowed, and even tempted, to advance to a point which had been skilfully undermined by the besieged. The mine was fired, and a great number of Moslems were blown into the air, while their comrades, fleeing in disorder, were further injured by a storm of shot from the ramparts. A similar device was resorted to with like success on the 13th of October. Reshid had to retire to a safe distance, and there build winter quarters for his diminished and starving army. Karaskakes and Zavelas entered Missolonghi without hindrance, there to concert measures which, had they been promptly adopted, might have utterly destroyed the besieging force. They delayed their plans too long. The Captain Pasha, having in August fled in a cowardly way to Alexandria, there effected a junction with the Egyptians, and returned to the neighbourhood of Missolonghi in the middle of November with a huge fleet of 135 vessels, well supplied with troops and provisions. These he landed at Patras on the 18th, just in time to be free from any annoyance that might have been occasioned by Miaoulis, who returned to Missolonghi on the 28th with a fleet of only 33 sail. He had vainly attacked part of the Moslem force on its way, and now, after landing some stores at Missolonghi, made several vain attempts to overcome a force 4 times as strong as his own. He soon retired, intending to return as promptly as he could collect a large fleet and bring with him further supplies of the provisions of which the Missolonghites were beginning to be in need. The need was greater even than he had imagined. Not only had the Captain Pasha brought temporary assistance in men and food to the besieging force, yet greater assistance soon came in the shape of an Egyptian army, led by Ibrahim Pasha himself. An overwhelming power was thus organized during the last weeks of 1825, and the defenders of Missolonghi were left to succumb to it almost unaided. Their previous successes had induced the Greeks of other districts to believe that they could continue their defence alone, and almost the only relief obtained by them was from the Zantiots, who had all along been zealous in the despatch of money and provisions, and from Miaoulis and the small fleet and equipment that he was able to collect from the islands of the archipelago. Miaoulis returned in January, 1826, and did much injury to the Turkish and Egyptian vessels, but he could offer no hindrance to the actions of the Turks and Egyptians upon land. The rainy months of December and January, in which no important attack could be entered upon, were spent by Ibrahim with his companions in preparation for future work. The invaders were now well provided with every requisite. The besieged were in want of nearly everything. "Invested for 10 months," says the contemporary historian, "frequently on the verge of starvation, thinned by fatigue, watching, and wounds, they had already buried 1,500 soldiers. The town was in ruins, and they lived amongst the mire and the water of their ditches, exposed to the inclemency of a rigorous season, without shoes in their tattered clothing. As far as their vision stretched over the waves, they beheld only Turkish flags. The plain was studded with Mussulman tents and standards, and the gradual appearance of new batteries more skilfully disposed. The field days of the Arabs and the noise of saws and hammers gave fearful warning. Yet these valiant Acarnanians, Etolians, and Epriots never flinched for an instant." On the 13th of January, Ibrahim Pasha sent to say that he was willing to treat with them for an honourable surrender if they would convey their terms by deputies who could speak Albanian, Turkish, and French. "We are illiterate and do not understand so many languages," was their blunt reply. "Pashas we do not recognise, but we know how to handle the sword and the gun." Sword and gun were handled with desperate prowess during February and March, and the early part of April. In April, offers of capitulation were renewed by Ibrahim, and more disinterested attempts to avert the worst calamity were made by Sir Frederick Adam, the Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands. Both proposals were stoutly rejected. The Missolonghites declared that they would defend their town to the last, and trust only in God and their own strong arms. But on the 1st of April, the last scanty distribution of public rations was exhausted. For 3 weeks the inhabitants subsisted upon nothing but cats, rats, hides, seaweed, and whatever other refuse and vermin they could collect. At length, on the 22nd of April, finding it impossible to hold out for a day longer, they resolved to evacuate the town in a body, and, cutting their way through the enemy, to try and join Karaskakis and his small force, who, hiding among the mountain fastnesses, were vainly seeking for some way of assisting them, and to whom they now despatched a message, asking them to advance and help clear a passage for their flight. After sunset, 4 bridges of planks were secretly laid over the outer ditch of Missolonghi, and the inhabitants were ordered to prepare to leave in 2 hours. Many, about 2,000, lost heart at last, some betaking themselves to the powder stores, there, when all help was over, to end their lives by easier death than the enemy might allow them. Others, crouching in the corners of their homesteads, deeming it better to be murdered there than in the open country. The rest obeyed the orders of their generals. All the women dressed themselves as men, with swords or daggers at their waists. Every child who could hold a weapon had one placed in his hand. There was bitter leave-taking, and desperate words of encouragement passed from one to another as the patriots were marshalled in the order of their departure. 3,000 fighting men to open a passage, and 4,000 women and children to follow, the whole being divided into 3 separate parties. At length all was ready, and the first party silently passed out of the town and advanced to the bridges. To their amazement, they no sooner appeared than they were met by volley after volley of Turkish fire. Traitor had revealed their plan, and every measure had been taken for their destruction. Some rushed on in despite, others hurried back to fall into confusion, which it was hard indeed to overcome. They felt, however, that this deadly chance was their only chance of life, and they pressed on through the fire and the swords of their foes, and, by the sheer heroism of despair, forced a passage to the mountains. Karaskakis' aid, apparently through no fault of his, was only obtained when the worst dangers had been surmounted or succumbed to. Of the 9,000 persons who were in Missolonghi on the day of the evacuation, 4,000 were killed in the town or on the way out of it. Only 1,300 men and 200 women and children lived to reach Salona after more than a week of wandering and hiding among the mountains. The long siege of Missolonghi illustrates all the best and some of the worst features of the Greek Revolution. In it there was patriotism worthy, in its bursts of splendour, of the nation that claimed descent from the heroes of Plataea and Thermopylae. But the patriotism was often fitful in its working, and often wholly wanting. The Greeks could not shake off the pernicious influences that sprang almost necessarily from their long centuries of thraldom. Heroism was closely linked with treachery and meanness. The worthiest and most disinterested energy was intimately associated with ignorance as to the right methods of action, and with wilful action in wrong ways. The elements of weakness that had been apparent from the first were more and more developed as the painful struggle reached its termination. It seems as if, in spite of Rashid Pasha and Ibrahim and their fierce armies, it would have been easy for Missolonghi and its brave defenders to have been saved. But rival ambitions and petty jealousies divided the leaders of the revolution. They were quarrelling, while the power that each one coveted for himself was step by step being wrested from them all. And when they tried to do well, their want of discipline often rendered their efforts of small avail. No adequate attempt was made to relieve Missolonghi by land, and the brave conduct of Mialis on the sea was almost neutralized by the disorganization of his crews and the selfish policy of the islanders who sent him out. "With respect to the Greek army," wrote General Ponsonby to the Duke of Wellington from Corfu on the 15th of June, "it is, generally speaking, a mob, and a chief can only calculate upon keeping it together as long as he has provisions to give it, or the prospect of plunder without danger. There is nothing to oppose the Egyptian army but a mob kept together by the small sums sent by the different committees in foreign countries. The Greeks have a great horror of the bayonet, which, however, they have never seen near except at Missolonghi. The Suliots, who chiefly form the garrison of that place, are fine men, and certainly fought with great courage. Much has been said of naval actions, but there is no truth in any of the accounts. The Greeks are better sailors than the Turks, but no action has been fought since the beginning of the war. If it is understood by action that there is risk and loss on both sides. The Greeks, however, have done wonders with their fleet. They have destroyed many large ships, and in the month of February last, with 23 brigs, they outmanoeuvred the Turkish fleet of 60 sail, and threw provisions into Missolonghi. This, though done by seamanship and not fighting, was called a great battle and a great victory. I was within 2 miles of the fleets, and the cannonade for 6 hours was tremendous. But when I spoke to Miaoulis the following morning, he told me he had not lost a man in his fleet." During the summer and winter following the fall of Missolonghi, a series of small disasters, the aggregate of which was by no means small, befell the Greeks. It was the opinion of all parties, and even admitted by jealous rivals, that the tottering cause of independence was only sustained by the constant and eager expectation of the arrival of the powerful fleet which was supposed to be on its way to the archipelago under the able leadership of Lord Cochrane, the world-famous champion of Chilian and Brazilian freedom. His approach was hardly more a cause of hope to the Greeks than a subject of fear to the Turks. No sooner was it publicly known that he had espoused the cause of the insurgents than angry complaints were made by the Turkish government to the British ministry, and Mr. Canning, then Foreign Secretary, had more than once to avow that the authorities of England knew nothing of his movements, and had done all that the law rendered possible to restrain him. He had also to promise that everything legal should be done to keep him in check on his arrival in Greek waters. "We have heard," he wrote in August to his cousin, Mr. Stratford Canning, afterwards Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, the ambassador to Constantinople, "that Lord Cochrane is gone to the Mediterranean. Whether it be really so, we know not." He then proceeded to define the bearing of English and international law in the existing circumstances. "Lord Cochrane may enter the Greek service and continue therein. He may even, as a Greek commander, institute, as he did in Brazil, blockades which British officers will respect, and exercise the belligerent rights of search on British merchant ships without exposing himself to any other penalty than that which the law will inflict upon him, if ever hereafter he shall again bring himself within its reach, and be duly convicted of the offence for the punishment of which that law was enacted. If, indeed, he should do any such things without a commission, he would become a pirate, and liable to the summary justice to which, without reference to the municipal laws of his country, he would, as an enemy of the human race, be liable, and liable just as much from the officers of any other country as his own." While that correspondence was going on, Lord Cochrane, as we have seen, was battling with a long series of delays, as irksome to himself as they were to the unfortunate Greeks. It was not until the 14th of September, about 8 months after the time fixed for the arrival of his whole fleet, that the first instalment of it, the Perseverance, which had been sent on as soon as it was completed, with Captain Abney Hastings as its commander, entered the harbour of Nauplia. On the 26th of October, Captain Hastings wrote a letter giving curious evidence of the estimate formed by him of the Greek character. It was left at Nauplia, and addressed to "the commander of the first American or English vessel that arrives in Greece to join the Greeks." "An apprenticeship in Greece tolerably long," he wrote, "has taught me the risks to which anybody newly arrived and possessed of some place and power is exposed. They know me, and they also know that I know them. Yet they have not ceased, and never will cease, intriguing to get this vessel out of my hands and into their own, which would be tantamount to ruining her. Knowing all this, I take the liberty of leaving this letter to be delivered to the first officer that arrives in Greece in the command of a vessel, to caution him not to receive on board his vessel any Greek captain. They will endeavour, under various pretences, to introduce themselves on board, and, once they have got a footing, they will gradually encroach until they feel themselves strong enough to turn out the original commander. The presence of such men can only be attended with inconvenience, for, if you are obliged to take a certain number of Greek sailors, these captains will render subordination among them impossible by their own irregularity and bad example. If you want seamen, take some from Hydra, Spetzas, Cranidi, or Poros. The Sarans may be trusted in very small numbers. Take a few men from one, a few from another island, and thus you will be best enabled to establish some kind of discipline. Take a good number of marines. Choose them from the peasantry and foreign Greeks, and you may make something of them. You must see, sir, that in this, my advice to the first officer arriving in command of a vessel, I can have no interest any further than inasmuch as I wish well to the Greek cause, and therefore do not wish to see a force that can be of great service rendered ineffective by falling into the hands of people totally incapable and unwilling to adopt a single right procedure. In Greece there cannot be any military operations except such as are carried out by foreigners in their service." That letter was written after Captain Hastings had endured a month's annoyance from the trouble brought upon him by the Hydriot officers and seamen who tried to oust him from the command of his fine vessel, whose name was now changed from the Perseverance to the Katerina. Unfortunately, his letter, left at Nauplia, did not reach the captain of the next reinforcement, the American frigate, which arrived at Aegina on the 8th of December. She was one of the finest ships in the world, we are told, carrying 64 long guns, long 32-pounders on the main, and 42-pound carronades on the upper deck, and filled with flour, ammunition, medicines, and marine stores for 18 months' consumption. The Greeks contemplated her with delight, but upon the departure of the American officers and seamen who navigated her out, they discovered that she would be more embarrassing than useful to them. To manage vessels of such size was beyond their capacity, and the mutual jealousy of the islanders suggested to the government the absurd notion of putting the frigate into commission, Hydra, Spetzas, and the Saran community being desired to send quotas of men. This plan was now found to be impracticable. Repeated fights occurred on board. The ship was twice in danger of being wrecked at Aegina, and at Poros she actually drifted ashore, luckily on soft mud. She was finally given up to Miaoulis, with a Hydriot crew of his own selection. This frigate, christened the Hellas, came too late to be of much service to Admiral Miaoulis before the arrival of Lord Cochrane. In the previous summer and autumn, however, he had been harassing and keeping at bay the Turkish and Egyptian fleets, work in which Hastings was in time to assist him. Andreas Miaoulis, one of the least obtrusive, was almost the worthiest of all the Greek patriots. During 5 years he had never ceased to do the best that it was possible for him to do with the bad materials at his disposal. When the Greek Revolution was at its height, he had contributed largely to its success, and in the ensuing years of disaster upon land he had maintained its dignity on the sea by offering bold resistance to the great naval power of the combined Turkish and Egyptian fleets. No better proof of his patriotism could be given than the zeal in which he surrendered to Lord Cochrane the leadership of the fleet which had devolved upon him for so long, and been so ably conducted by him. "I received 4 days ago," he wrote from Poros on the 23rd of February, 1827, "your amiable letter of the 19th of last month, and my great satisfaction at the announcement of your approaching arrival in Greece is joined with a special pleasure at the honour you do me and associating me with your important operations. I shall be happy, my Admiral, if in serving you I can do my duty. I await you with impatience." Just a month before that, on the 23rd of January, a like letter of congratulation was addressed to Lord Cochrane from Aegina by the Governing Commission of Greece. "The intelligence of your speedy coming to Greece," they said, "has awakened the liveliest joy and satisfaction, and has already begun to rekindle in the hearts of the Greeks the enthusiasm which is the most powerful weapon and the surest support of a nation that has devoted itself to the recovery of its most sacred rights. The government of Greece is waiting with the utmost impatience for the most zealous defender of the nation's liberty. It hopes to see you in its midst as soon as possible after your arrival at Hydra, and then to make you acquainted with the actual state of Greece, and to furnish you with all means in its power for the achievement of the grand results proposed by your lordship." The letter was signed by Andreas Zames as president of the commission, and by 7 of its members, among whom were Mavromichales, or Petro Bey, who, with Zames and 2 others, represented the Morea; Spiridion; Trikoupes, the deputy for Roumelia; Zamados from Hydra; Monarchides from Sara; and Dimitrakopoulos from the islands of the Aegean Sea. By the same body was issued, on the 21st of February, a preliminary commission, intended to protect him in case of any opposition being raised to his progress by the authorities of other nations. "The Governing Commission of Greece," it was written, "makes known that Admiral Lord Cochrane is recognised as being in the service of Greece, and accordingly has the permission of the Government to hoist the Greek flag on all the vessels that are under his command. He has power also to fight the enemies of Greece to the utmost of his power. Therefore the officers of neutral powers, being informed of this, are implored not only to offer no opposition to his movements, but also, if necessary, to supply him with any assistance he may require, seeing that it is our custom to do the same to all friendly nations." Armed with this document, and provided with the necessary means by the Philhellenes of England, France, and Switzerland, Lord Cochrane proceeded from Marseilles to Greece. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.